Sarah Chen looked perfectly ordinary as she walked through the corridors of the Galactic Research Station Omega-7. Her brown hair was tied back in a simple ponytail, and her standard-issue jumpsuit showed no signs of rank or special status. To the dozens of alien species working alongside her, she appeared to be just another human technician going about her daily routine. The Zephyrians with their crystalline skin barely glanced at her as she passed. The massive Grontak engineers, standing nearly 3 meters tall, paid her no attention as they discussed plasma conduit repairs. Even the telepathic Mindari seemed uninterested in scanning her thoughts. Humans were known for their chaotic, unpredictable mental patterns that gave most telepaths headaches. Sarah had been assigned to the station 6 months ago as part of the Terran Federation's civilian exchange program. Her official job was maintaining the atmospheric recycling systems, work that required her to access nearly every section of the vast space station. She performed her duties with quiet competence, never complaining about the long hours or the occasionally condescending attitudes of some alien supervisors who viewed humans as the newest and least advanced members of the Galactic Consortium. What none of them knew was that Sarah Chen was no ordinary technician. Deep beneath her unremarkable exterior lay years of the most intensive training the human military had ever devised. She was a product of Project Sleeper, a classified program that had taken the best and brightest from Earth's special forces and transformed them into something unprecedented. The Galactic Consortium believed humans were weak, slow, and limited by their biology. They had no idea what human determination and ingenuity could accomplish when properly focused. On this particular morning, Sarah was running her usual diagnostic on the air filtration systems in Section C when her communication device chirped with what appeared to be a routine maintenance alert. To anyone monitoring the channels, it looked like a standard notification about a minor malfunction in the waste processing unit. But the specific frequency and pulse pattern told Sarah everything she needed to know. The sleeper protocol had been activated. She finished her current task with the same methodical precision she always showed, giving no outward sign that anything had changed. Her heartbeat remained steady, her breathing unchanged. Years of conditioning had taught her to control every involuntary response, every micro-expression that might betray her true nature. She was a weapon disguised as a tool, and today that weapon would finally be drawn. As she made her way to the next section, Sarah's enhanced memory began processing the complete layout of the station that she had been gradually mapping for months. Every security checkpoint, every patrol route, every weakness in the station's defenses was cataloged in her mind with photographic precision. The consortium races were technologically advanced, but they had grown complacent in their superiority. They couldn't imagine that the primitive humans might pose any real threat. The mission parameters began unfolding in her consciousness like a complex flower blooming. Intelligence suggested that the hegemony, a militant faction opposed to human inclusion in the consortium, was planning to use this very station as a staging ground for an attack on human colonies. The evidence was hidden somewhere in the station's data cores, but conventional infiltration had failed. The hegemony security was too tight, their suspicion of official human diplomatic efforts too high. That's where Project Sleeper came in. A single agent placed years in advance, living a completely normal life until the moment came to strike. Sarah had spent 18 months in deep cover just to get assigned to this station, building a flawless background as a civilian technician. Every document, every reference, every piece of her false identity had been crafted to perfection. The beauty of the plan was its simplicity. While the consortium spent enormous resources monitoring human military movements and diplomatic communications, they paid no attention to the thousands of ordinary human workers scattered throughout their territory. Sarah was hiding in plain sight, invisible because she was exactly what she appeared to be until she wasn't. As she entered the maintenance shaft that would take her to Section D, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. The Grontak security chief who had processed her arrival had been openly dismissive, making jokes about assigning the little human to cleaning duties. The Mindari council member had casually probed her surface thoughts during orientation and found nothing but concern about performing her job well and homesickness for Earth. They had seen exactly what she wanted them to see. The psychological conditioning that was part of Project Sleeper went far beyond simple acting. Sarah's cover identity wasn't a role she played. It was a complete personality overlay that had been carefully constructed and implanted. For months, she genuinely had been nothing more than Sarah Chen, technician. The real operative lay dormant beneath, waiting for the activation code that would bring her true self to the surface. Now, as she moved through the station's service corridors with the easy familiarity of someone who had walked these paths hundreds of times, that dormant identity was awakening. Knowledge that had been locked away began flowing back into her conscious mind. Muscle memory that had been suppressed started reasserting itself. Skills that could have marked her as dangerous were becoming available once again. The other species in the consortium had evolved along different paths than humanity. The Zephyrians were logical and precise but lacked creativity. The Grontak were physically powerful but slow to adapt. The Mindari had incredible mental abilities but were vulnerable to sudden, decisive action. Each race had its strengths, but they also had predictable weaknesses. Humans were different. They were adaptable, unpredictable, and driven by an almost irrational determination to overcome obstacles. What the consortium saw as primitive stubbornness, human military theorists recognized as humanity's greatest tactical advantage. When other species calculated odds and made rational decisions, humans simply refused to accept defeat. Sarah Chen, the technician, was about to disappear forever, replaced by something the Galactic Consortium had never encountered before. A human operative with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The station's occupants continued their daily routines, unaware that their perfectly ordered world was about to be turned upside down by one small, unremarkable human who had been hiding among them all along. The hunt was about to begin. The transformation was subtle but complete. As Sarah moved through the station's lower levels, her gait changed from the hurried shuffle of a busy technician to the fluid, economical movement of a predator. Her eyes, which had spent months focused on maintenance schedules and repair manuals, now cataloged every security camera, every potential weapon, every escape route. The activation signal had triggered more than just memories. It had unlocked physical modifications that had been dormant in her system. Nanoscale enhancers that had masqueraded as routine medical implants began optimizing her reflexes, sharpening her senses, and flooding her bloodstream with carefully calibrated chemical cocktails that would sustain peak performance for days without rest. Her first objective was the data core in Section G, but getting there meant passing through 3 security checkpoints and 2 restricted zones. The direct route would take her past dozens of alien personnel who might notice changes in her behavior. But Sarah Chen, the technician, had spent months learning every maintenance tunnel, every service shaft, every forgotten corridor in this massive station. She slipped into a ventilation access point that the station's automated systems showed as a minor atmospheric monitoring station. In reality, it was part of an intricate network of passages that honeycombed the entire structure. The consortium's architects had built the station to accommodate the needs of multiple species, each with different environmental requirements. The result was a maze of redundant systems and forgotten spaces that someone with the right knowledge could navigate unseen. As she crawled through the narrow passage, Sarah's enhanced hearing picked up fragments of conversation from the occupied areas around her. The Zephyrians in the communications center were discussing routine traffic control. A group of Mindari researchers was debating the ethics of consciousness transfer experiments. The Grontak security team was complaining about the poor quality of the station's entertainment programs. Normal, everyday conversations that revealed just how unprepared they were for what was coming. The intelligence that had triggered her activation spoke of a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of the consortium government. The hegemony wasn't just a fringe group of human haters. They were a coordinated faction with support from species that viewed humanity's rapid advancement as a threat to the established order. The evidence of their plans was hidden in this station's classified databases, protected by security systems that were considered impenetrable. They had never dealt with human determination before. Sarah emerged from the ventilation system into a storage area filled with spare components for the station's sensor array. The irony wasn't lost on her. Surrounded by devices designed to detect threats, she remained completely invisible to their sophisticated scanners. Human biorhythms were still poorly understood by consortium science, and the modifications in her system were designed to mimic the chaotic patterns that aliens expected. From human physiology, the door to Section G, required biometric authorization from someone with level 7 clearance or higher. Sarah had been watching the patterns for months, noting which individuals had access and when they typically used it. Dr. Kelrath, a Mindari xenobiologist, passed through this checkpoint every morning at exactly 0847 hours to check on his consciousness research project. She positioned herself in the shadows near the checkpoint and waited. Her enhanced chronometer told her she had 3 minutes until Kelrath's routine arrival. In the old days before Project Sleeper, this would have required backup teams, complex equipment, and elaborate timing. Now it just required patience and the absolute confidence that came from perfect preparation. Kelrath appeared right on schedule, his elongated Mindari form moving with the characteristic floating gait of his species. As he approached the biometric scanner, Sarah emerged from concealment and did something that no one in the consortium would have expected from a human technician. She moved faster than Kelrath's enhanced reflexes could follow. The Mindari were telepaths, accustomed to sensing hostile intent long before physical action could threaten them, but Sarah's training had included extensive work with human psychics who had taught her to compartmentalize her thoughts. While her conscious mind focused on technical diagrams and maintenance schedules, her deeper conditioning executed the mission parameters with mechanical precision. Kelrath found himself gently but irresistibly guided through the security checkpoint, his biometric scan completed before his telepathic senses even registered the presence of another being. Sarah's touch on his arm was so light, so professional, that his conscious mind interpreted it as an accidental bump from a clumsy human who had been trying to apologize. "Sorry, Dr. Kelrath," Sarah said in the slightly accented standard that marked her as a recent arrival from Earth. "Didn't see you there. These maintenance schedules have me running all over the station." The Mindari scientist paused, his large eyes focusing on her with the intense scrutiny of someone trying to understand what had just happened. His telepathic probe touched the surface of her mind and found exactly what it expected: the chaotic, emotion-driven thought patterns of a typical human, currently occupied with concerns about completing her work assignments on time. "Quite all right," Kelrath replied, though something in his tone suggested lingering confusion. "You are the atmospheric systems technician, correct? I believe I've seen your work reports. Very thorough. Thank you, sir. I just want to do my job well." The response was perfectly pitched, grateful but not obsequious, professional but not suspicious. Sarah had spent years learning to be forgettable, to project exactly the image that would make others dismiss her as unimportant. As Kelrath continued toward his laboratory, Sarah slipped through the still open checkpoint and into Section G. The data core was 3 levels down, in a chamber that existed in the precise center of the station's structure. Getting there would require her to pass through areas where a maintenance technician had no business being, but Project Sleeper had anticipated that problem as well. The cover identity of Sarah, Chen, came with something that most station personnel took for granted: a universal maintenance access card that allowed her to perform routine inspections anywhere in the station. The card was genuine, issued through proper channels, backed by all the appropriate authorizations. The fact that those authorizations had been obtained through a combination of bureaucratic manipulation, identity theft, and computer infiltration was invisible to the station's security systems. She moved through Section G with the confident stride of someone who belonged there, occasionally checking her handheld scanner and making notes on her electronic pad. To anyone observing her, she was simply another technician performing the unglamorous but essential work that kept the station functioning. The perfect camouflage for someone about to commit what would probably be considered the greatest intelligence coup in human history. The data core chamber was protected by automated defenses that could kill an intruder in milliseconds, but those same defenses were programmed to ignore authorized maintenance personnel performing routine system checks. Sarah's enhanced memory contained complete schematics of every security system, every failsafe, every backup protocol that protected the consortium's most sensitive information. As she approached the final checkpoint before the core chamber, Sarah allowed herself a moment of anticipation. In a few minutes, she would have access to intelligence that could prevent a war, protect human colonies, and demonstrate once and for all that humanity deserved its place among the stars. The consortium had made the mistake of underestimating human potential. They were about to learn just how costly that error could be. The data core chamber hummed with barely contained energy, Massive crystalline storage matrices lined the walls, each one containing petabytes of information that represented centuries of consortium knowledge. At the center of the room, a quantum processing unit the size of a small building pulsed with soft blue light, its alien architecture beautiful and intimidating in equal measure. Sarah stood at the threshold for a moment, appreciating the irony of her situation. The most secure location on one of the consortium's most important stations, protected by weapons that could vaporize an attacking fleet, and she had walked in through the front door with a maintenance badge and a smile. The security protocols were impressive by any standard. Motion detectors that could track movement down to the molecular level, pressure sensors calibrated to detect the weight of a single breath, electromagnetic scanners that mapped every metallic object within 50 meters, energy weapons that could fire with precision measured in nanoseconds, all of it designed to stop soldiers, spies, and saboteurs. None of it programmed to recognize the threat posed by a woman with a toolbox and a work order. Sarah activated her scanner and began a genuine diagnostic of the atmospheric systems that fed into the data core. The readings were actually important. The quantum processors required incredibly precise environmental conditions to function properly, and any deviation could corrupt the stored information. As she worked, her enhanced senses were simultaneously mapping the chamber's defenses and identifying the access points she would need. The beauty of her cover was that it was completely authentic. Every action she took was justified. Every tool she carried was exactly what a technician would need. Every procedure she followed was documented in official maintenance protocols. She wasn't infiltrating the chamber. She was officially assigned to be here. Her scanner detected a minor fluctuation in the humidity control system, exactly the kind of small problem that maintenance personnel were supposed to find and fix. Sarah made a note in her official report and moved to the relevant control panel. Her movements tracked and approved by the automated security systems that recognized her access credentials. The quantum storage matrix that contained the classified hegemony files was protected by encryption that the consortium believed was mathematically unbreakable. What they didn't know was that human mathematicians had been working on theoretical solutions to quantum encryption for decades, long before humanity had the technology to implement such systems. When Project Sleeper had been planned, those theoretical solutions had been refined into practical tools. Sarah connected her maintenance scanner to the environmental control interface, ostensibly to calibrate the humidity sensors. In reality, the scanner contained a quantum processing unit of its own, one that had been built using principles that the consortium's own scientists had dismissed as impossible. Human engineering had always excelled at making the impossible merely improbable. The decryption process would take approximately 4 minutes, far longer than any conventional infiltration could hope to avoid detection, but well within the time frame of a routine maintenance check. While the scanner worked, Sarah continued her official duties, adjusting atmospheric controls and running diagnostics that would actually improve the chamber's efficiency. As she worked, fragments of intercepted communications began flowing into her consciousness through the neural link that connected her to the scanner. The hegemony files were massive, containing years of planning and coordination between multiple species. What she found there made her blood run cold. The attack on human colonies wasn't just a raid, it was genocide. The hegemony had developed biological weapons specifically designed to target human physiology. Diseases that would devastate Earth's population while leaving other species unaffected. The plan was to eliminate humanity's homeworld and then claim that human colonial settlements were no longer viable without support from Earth. The surviving human populations would be relocated to protected reservations where they could be gradually absorbed into consortium society or allowed to die out entirely. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. High-ranking officials from a dozen different species were involved, including several members of the consortium's ruling council. The evidence was comprehensive, undeniable, and absolutely damning, but it was also protected by security measures that would destroy the data if any unauthorized access was detected. Sarah's scanner completed its work just as alarms began sounding throughout the station. Not security alarms, she was still undetected, but emergency sirens that indicated some kind of massive system failure. Through her neural link, she could access the station's communication channels and quickly determined what was happening. A hegemony strike force had just dropped out of hyperspace and was demanding that the station surrender. The attack wasn't scheduled to begin for another 3 days, according to the files she had accessed, but something had accelerated their timeline. The element of surprise that Sarah had counted on was evaporating rapidly. Station personnel were rushing to emergency stations throughout the facility. Security protocols were shifting to wartime configurations. The window of opportunity for her to complete the mission and escape was closing with frightening speed. But Sarah Chen had trained for scenarios exactly like this one. She completed the download of the hegemony files while simultaneously triggering a cascade failure in the station's security systems. The failure would look like a result of the emergency protocols conflicting with routine maintenance procedures. Exactly the kind of bureaucratic mishap that happened during crisis situations. By the time anyone realized what had actually occurred, she would be long gone. The evacuation alarms provided perfect cover for her movement through the station. Corridors that had been monitored and patrolled were now filled with confused aliens, trying to reach their assigned emergency positions. Sarah moved against the flow of traffic, her maintenance credentials allowing her access to restricted areas that were being sealed off from civilian personnel. Her neural link was receiving constant updates from Earth's intelligence network. The hegemony attack was being coordinated from a command ship that had positioned itself just outside the station's defensive perimeter. If she could reach the communications array and transmit the data she had stolen, Earth's fleet would have everything they needed to prove the conspiracy and rally the loyal elements of the consortium against the hegemony. But first, she had to survive the next few hours. As she reached the maintenance shaft that would take her to the communications center, Sarah's enhanced hearing picked up a conversation that made her freeze in place. A group of Zephyrian security officers was discussing the fact that one of their number had detected unusual quantum signatures in the data core chamber. They were organizing a systematic sweep to find the source of the anomaly. Her cover was blown. The investigation would inevitably lead them to the maintenance logs, and from there to her access records. Within minutes, they would know exactly who she was and where she had been. Her carefully constructed identity as Sarah Chen, technician, was about to become a liability rather than an asset. It was time for the other side of her training to take over. Sarah Chen, the maintenance worker, ceased to exist. In her place stood something that the Galactic Consortium had never encountered before. A human operative with nothing left to lose, surrounded by enemies, and equipped with the most advanced training that human military science could provide. The hegemony wanted a war. They were about to discover that they had picked a fight with the wrong species. Sarah's hand moved to the concealed weapon that had been disguised as a calibration tool, her enhanced reflexes already calculating angles and distances. The hunt was no longer about gathering intelligence. Now it was about survival, and humans had always excelled at that particular skill. The first Zephyrian security officer rounded the corner at precisely the moment Sarah's transformation completed itself. What he saw was no longer the harmless human technician who had been wandering the station's corridors for months. Instead, he found himself face to face with something that his evolutionary programming had no framework for understanding. Sarah moved with the fluid precision of a striking snake, her concealed weapon materializing in her hand as if it had always been there. The Zephyrian's crystalline skin, which could deflect most energy weapons, proved useless against the hypervelocity projectile that punched through his torso before his enhanced reflexes could even register the threat. The weapon itself was a masterpiece of human engineering, a railgun no larger than a stylus, powered by the same energy cells that had been masquerading as life support monitors in her equipment belt. Each projectile was a sliver of dense metal accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed, capable of penetrating any known armor while producing almost no sound or energy signature. The second Zephyrian was still processing the impossibility of what he had witnessed when Sarah's follow-up shot punched through the wall behind him and detonated a plasma conduit, plunging the entire corridor into darkness. Emergency lighting cast everything in a hellish, red glow that suited Sarah's purposes perfectly. Human. Eyes adapted to low-light conditions far better than most alien species. She was already moving before the second body hit the ground, her enhanced senses tracking the approaching footsteps of the rest of the security team. The corridor junction ahead offered 3 possible routes, but only one led toward the communications array. The others would take her deeper into areas where she could be trapped and overwhelmed. The problem was that the direct route was now blocked by at least 6 more security officers, all of them armed with weapons that could reduce her to constituent atoms. A conventional approach would be suicide, but Sarah had never been trained for conventional warfare. She activated the emergency fire suppression system with a carefully placed shot at the control panel, instantly filling the corridor with dense foam that blocked visual sensors and created enough electromagnetic interference to disrupt most targeting systems. The Zephyrians began firing blindly, their energy weapons creating brilliant flashes that only made the confusion worse. Sarah ghosted through the chaos like a wraith, her movements guided by the mental map she had constructed during months of careful observation. While the security team stumbled through the foam-filled corridor, she was already 3 levels above them, moving through maintenance shafts that most aliens couldn't even fit into. The communications array was located in the station's upper section, surrounded by defensive systems that were currently focused on the external threat posed by the hegemony fleet. Internal security protocols had been downgraded to deal with the evacuation, creating exactly the kind of opportunity that Project Sleeper had been designed to exploit. As she climbed through the narrow access tunnel, Sarah's neural link provided a constant stream of updates about the battle developing around the station. The hegemony forces were demanding surrender, claiming that they had evidence of human infiltrators aboard the facility. It would have been laughable if it weren't so accurate. The consortium's response was exactly what Sarah had expected: bureaucratic confusion combined with stubborn pride. Instead of evacuating or negotiating, they were powering up their defensive systems and calling for reinforcements. The station was about to become a battleground, with herself trapped in the middle. But that also meant that everyone's attention was focused outward, toward the obvious threat, rather than inward toward the much more dangerous enemy already inside their perimeter. She emerged from the access tunnel into the communications center just as the first exchange of fire lit up the space around the station. Through the massive observation windows, she could see the sleek forms of hegemony warships maneuvering into attack positions while the station's defensive platforms swiveled to track them. The communications center was staffed by a mixed crew of aliens, all of them frantically trying to coordinate defensive efforts and maintain contact with Consortium Command. None of them paid any attention to the human technician who emerged from a maintenance hatch and began checking the atmospheric system. Sarah's scanner identified the primary communication relay within seconds. The device was a crystalline matrix similar to the data storage systems in the core chamber, but designed for instantaneous transmission across interstellar distances. Getting access to it would require her to bypass security protocols that were currently locked down due to the emergency, or she could simply destroy the existing relay and replace it with one of her own. The replacement communication matrix had been hidden in her equipment belt for months, disguised as a backup power cell for her diagnostic equipment. It was identical to the station's primary relay in every way except one. It would also transmit everything to a hidden receiver that Earth's intelligence services had positioned in this system. Replacing the matrix would require approximately 30 seconds of direct access to the communication console. Under normal circumstances, that would be impossible with the center fully staffed. But these weren't normal circumstances. Sarah activated her railgun's wide dispersal mode and put a single shot into the center's main power distribution node. The explosion killed the lights and sent every alien in the room scrambling for emergency stations. In the confusion that followed, she calmly walked to the communication console and began the replacement procedure. The old matrix came free with a soft click, its crystalline structure dim now that power had been cut. Sarah slipped it into her belt and installed the replacement, her enhanced reflexes allowing her to complete the delicate work even in the flickering emergency lighting. As power was restored to the center, the new matrix came online seamlessly. To every sensor and diagnostic system, it was identical to the original. But now, every communication that passed through the station's relay would also be transmitted to Earth's intelligence network, including the complete files on the hegemony conspiracy that she had downloaded from the data core. The transmission began immediately, her data streaming toward Earth at faster-than-light speeds through the quantum entanglement network that connected all consortium communication systems. Within hours, Human Command would have everything they needed to expose the conspiracy and rally the loyal members of the consortium against the hegemony. But Sarah wasn't done yet. Through the observation windows, she could see that the hegemony fleet was moving into bombardment positions. They weren't planning to capture the station. They intended to destroy it completely, eliminating any evidence of their conspiracy along with everyone aboard, including her. The station's defensive systems were formidable, but they had been designed to fight conventional fleet actions, not the kind of coordinated assault that the hegemony was launching. Analysis of their attack patterns, flowing through her neural link from Earth's tactical computers, suggested that the station's shields would fail within the next 2 hours unless someone did something to change the tactical situation. Sarah's mission parameters had included contingencies for exactly this scenario. If extraction became impossible and the intelligence she had gathered was at risk, she was authorized to take whatever action was necessary to protect it. The consortium might see her as a terrorist, but Earth would remember her as a hero. She made her way toward the station's reactor core, her railgun reloading itself from the ammunition supply that had been disguised as atmospheric monitoring equipment. The reactor was protected by automated defenses that could stop an army, but they weren't designed to stop someone who had spent months learning every weakness in the station's security. If she couldn't escape, she would ensure that the hegemony's victory was as costly as possible. And if the station had to die, it would take as many of their ships with it as she could manage. The human capacity for spite, it turned out, was just as dangerous as human ingenuity. As alarms continued to blare throughout the station, Sarah began the final phase of her mission. The hegemony thought they were fighting a war against primitive humans who could be easily eliminated. They were about to learn the difference between fighting humans and fighting humanity itself. The reactor core of Station Omega-7 was a marvel of consortium engineering. A fusion plant the size of a city block that had been running continuously for over 50 years. The chamber housing it was carved from a single piece of titanium-enhanced asteroid rock, surrounded by magnetic fields that could contain stellar-level temperatures and radiation levels that would kill most organic life in microseconds. Sarah approached the core through the maintenance tunnels that she had mapped during her months of cover work. The irony was perfect. Her official duties as an atmospheric technician had required her to inspect the environmental systems that kept the reactor chamber habitable for maintenance crews. She knew every safety protocol, every emergency shutdown procedure, every weakness in the containment systems. The hegemony fleet had closed to optimal firing range and begun their bombardment in earnest. The station's shields flared with each impact, brilliant cascades of energy that lit up the surrounding space like a captured star. Through her neural link, Sarah could monitor the shield status in real time. They were holding for now, but the pattern of attack suggested that the hegemony commanders knew exactly where to concentrate their fire for maximum effect. Someone had provided them with detailed specifications for the station's defensive systems. The conspiracy went deeper than even the stolen files had revealed. The reactor chamber's security was impressive even by military standards. Automated plasma turrets tracked every movement within the space, programmed to vaporize anything that wasn't supposed to be there. Force field barriers could slice through molecular bonds with surgical precision. Environmental systems that could flood the chamber with everything from nerve gas to liquid nitrogen. All of it keyed to recognize authorized personnel through a combination of biometric scans, quantum signatures, and behavioral analysis algorithms that could detect hostile intent. Sarah's maintenance credentials gave her access to the chamber, but any attempt to sabotage the reactor would trigger defensive systems that even her enhanced reflexes couldn't avoid. Unless she convinced those same systems that sabotage was actually maintenance, she entered the chamber with the same calm professionalism that had marked all her work on the station, her scanner active and recording atmospheric readings that were genuinely important for reactor safety. The fusion core itself was a thing of terrible beauty, a miniature sun held captive by magnetic fields. Its light filtered through radiation shielding that reduced it to a warm golden glow. The maintenance console that controlled the reactor's safety systems was positioned at the chamber's center, surrounded by diagnostic equipment that monitored every aspect of the fusion reaction. Sarah had studied these systems extensively during her cover assignment, ostensibly to ensure that atmospheric conditions remained optimal for equipment operation. What she had actually been doing was learning how to turn the station's greatest strength into its greatest weakness. The fusion reactor that powered Station Omega-7 was designed with multiple redundant safety systems to prevent catastrophic failure. Magnetic containment fields, emergency shutdown protocols, plasma dump channels that could vent excess energy safely into space. Under normal circumstances, it was virtually impossible for the reactor to explode. But these weren't normal circumstances. Sarah connected her scanner to the maintenance console and began what appeared to be a routine diagnostic of the magnetic containment system. The procedure was documented in official protocols, justified by the combat conditions that were stressing every system on the station. Her actions were being recorded by security systems that recognized her authority to perform exactly this kind of inspection. While the scanner ran its diagnostic, Sarah's enhanced memory was processing the tactical situation outside the station. The hegemony fleet had arranged itself in a spherical formation that would allow them to concentrate fire on the station's shields while preventing any escape. It was a textbook siege deployment, designed to minimize their own casualties while ensuring complete destruction of their target. They had made one critical error in their planning, though. They had positioned themselves close enough to the station to benefit from overlapping fields of fire, but that also meant they were close enough to be caught in the blast radius if the reactor core went critical. A properly designed reactor explosion, shaped and directed by someone who understood the physics involved, could take out half their fleet. The diagnostic completed its first phase, and Sarah began the delicate work of reprogramming the containment system's emergency protocols. She wasn't disabling the safety systems. That would have triggered immediate alarms. Instead, she was convincing them that a controlled overload was actually a safety procedure designed to prevent uncontrolled overload. The beauty of the modification was that it would only activate if the station's shields failed completely. Until that moment, the reactor would continue to operate normally, providing power for the defensive systems that were currently holding the hegemony at bay. But when the shields finally collapsed, the reactor would interpret the massive power drain as a sign that emergency protocols needed to be activated, and then it would detonate with the force of a small star. As she worked, Sarah's neural link was receiving updates from Earth's intelligence network. Her data transmission had been received and was already being analyzed by teams of experts who were working around the clock to verify the evidence and prepare for diplomatic action. The consortium's loyal members were being quietly contacted, warned about the conspiracy, and asked to choose sides. But all of that would take time, and time was the one thing that Station Omega-7 didn't have. The shield generators were operating at 112% of rated capacity, well beyond their normal safety margins. Engineering teams throughout the station were performing miracles of improvisation to keep the defensive systems online, but they were fighting a losing battle against simple mathematics. The hegemony fleet was too large, their weapons too powerful, their coordination too precise. Sarah completed the final modifications to the reactor control system just as the first shield generator overloaded and shut down. Emergency power routing protocols kicked in immediately, redistributing the defensive load to the remaining generators, but the station's protective envelope had been weakened. The hegemony commanders recognized the opportunity and concentrated their fire on the failed section. A second generator failed, then a third. The cascade effect that Sarah had been expecting began to accelerate as each failure put additional strain on the surviving systems. The station's defensive coordinator was calling for emergency power from non-essential systems, but there simply wasn't enough available to maintain the shields indefinitely. Sarah made her way out of the reactor chamber and toward the evacuation pods, her official mission now complete. The modified reactor would ensure that the hegemony's victory would be Pyrrhic at best, and the intelligence she had transmitted would eventually expose their conspiracy to the entire consortium. Project Sleeper had achieved its objectives. But as she moved through corridors filled with panicking aliens, Sarah found herself thinking about the station's crew. Most of them were innocent civilians who had no involvement in the hegemony conspiracy. Scientists, engineers, maintenance, workers like herself, People who were about to die because they had been in the wrong place when powerful forces decided to play their games. The evacuation pods could carry perhaps 10% of the station's population to safety. The rest would die when the reactor core detonated, victims of a war they didn't even know they were fighting. Sarah paused at a corridor junction, her enhanced reflexes tracking the movement of fleeing personnel, while her tactical mind calculated possibilities. The hegemony fleet was positioned to prevent any large-scale evacuation, but they were also arranged in a formation that made them vulnerable to a precisely timed reactor explosion. If she could modify the detonation sequence one more time, she might be able to maximize the damage to the hegemony while giving the station's crew a few extra minutes to reach the escape pods. It would mean returning to the reactor chamber, which was now in the middle of the station's most heavily defended section. It would mean abandoning her own chance of escape. It would mean certain death. But it would also mean that thousands of innocent lives might be saved, and that the hegemony would pay a price that would make them think twice before attempting genocide again. Sarah Chen, the technician, would never have made such a choice. But Sarah Chen, the technician, no longer existed. She turned away from the evacuation pods and began making her way back toward the reactor core, her railgun charging for what would certainly be its final use. The journey back to the reactor core took Sarah through sections of the station that were rapidly becoming uninhabitable. Emergency bulkheads had sealed off areas where the hull had been breached, and the corridors that remained accessible were filled with smoke, debris, and the acrid smell of overloaded systems. She moved against the flow of evacuation traffic, a lone figure pushing deeper into danger while everyone else fled toward safety. The few station personnel who noticed her assumed she was responding to some critical maintenance emergency, which, in a way, she was. The reactor chamber's security systems were in chaos. Power fluctuations from the ongoing bombardment had triggered multiple false alarms, and the automated defenses were struggling to distinguish between authorized personnel and actual threats. Sarah's maintenance credentials still granted her access, but she could see that the security protocols were degrading rapidly. Inside the chamber, the fusion core was running far beyond its normal parameters. The massive power draws from the failing shield generators had forced the reactor into emergency overload conditions that the designers had never intended it to sustain. The golden glow that had seemed so peaceful during her earlier visit was now a harsh glare that made the radiation shielding creak. Ominously, Sarah's enhanced senses could detect the stress patterns in the containment fields, the subtle fluctuations that warned of impending failure. The reactor was already approaching critical levels. Her earlier modifications had simply ensured that when it finally went critical, the explosion would be directed outward rather than contained, but the timing was wrong. At its current rate of decay, the reactor would explode approximately 3 minutes after the shields failed completely. That would give the hegemony fleet enough time to begin their bombardment of the station's unprotected hull, killing most of the crew before the explosion could reach them. She needed to accelerate the process while simultaneously giving the evacuation more time to succeed. It was a delicate balance that required precise modifications to systems that were already operating at the edge of catastrophic failure. The maintenance console was sparking intermittently, its displays flickering as power surges overloaded the monitoring equipment. Sarah connected her scanner directly to the reactor's control matrix, bypassing the failing interface systems and accessing the core programming that managed the fusion reaction. Through her neural link, she could monitor the battle raging outside the station. 2 more shield generators had failed, and the hegemony was pouring fire into the weakened sections of the defensive grid. The station's return fire was becoming increasingly sporadic as power was diverted from weapons to maintain the remaining shields. But something else was happening that the hegemony commanders hadn't anticipated. The consortium's loyalist forces were arriving in response to the intelligence that Sarah had transmitted. The first scout ships were already dropping out of hyperspace at the edge of the system, their sensors recording everything for later use as evidence of the conspiracy. The hegemony faced a choice: complete their destruction of the station quickly and retreat before the loyalist forces could intervene, or risk exposure by engaging in a prolonged battle. Their response was predictable. They increased their rate of fire, concentrating everything they had on breaking through the station's remaining defenses. Sarah's fingers flew over the control interface as she implemented the new modifications. Instead of waiting for complete shield failure, the reactor would now begin its final overload sequence when shield strength dropped below 20%. The explosion would be slightly less powerful, but it would catch the hegemony fleet at the moment when they were most committed to their attack. The timing would also give the evacuation pods approximately 8 additional minutes to clear the blast radius. As she worked, Sarah became aware that she was no longer alone in the chamber. A group of Galactic engineers had entered through the secondary access tunnel, their massive forms moving with surprising grace as they attempted to perform emergency repairs on the failing containment system. They didn't immediately notice the human technician working at the main console, their attention focused on the critical task of preventing a reactor breach that they believed would destroy the station without accomplishing anything strategic. Sarah watched them for a moment, appreciating the irony of their efforts to prevent exactly what she was trying to cause. The lead engineer, a veteran whose chitinous carapace showed the scars of decades of dangerous work, finally spotted Sarah and approached the console. "Human technician," he said in heavily accented standard. "This area is restricted during combat operations. You must evacuate immediately." Sarah looked up from her work, meeting the Galactic's compound eyes with a steady gaze. "Just finishing some critical diagnostics," she replied. "The atmospheric systems in here are showing anomalous readings that could affect reactor stability." It was technically true, though not in the way the engineer would interpret it. The atmospheric composition in the chamber was indeed changing, as Sarah's modifications altered the fusion reaction's byproducts. The Galactic studied her scanner's displays for a moment, his expression unreadable behind his insectoid features. "These readings are unusual," he said slowly. "I am not familiar with this type of atmospheric analysis." "What exactly are you measuring?" Sarah's enhanced reflexes calculated angles and distances, while her conscious mind maintained the conversation. The Galactic engineer was standing between her and the console, his massive bulk effectively blocking her access to the final control systems she needed to reach. His 3 companions were positioned throughout the chamber, all of them armed with engineering tools that could easily serve as weapons. "Quantum resonance patterns in the atmospheric molecules," Sarah replied, her voice maintaining the same professional tone she had used throughout her months of cover work. "The fusion reaction creates exotic particles that can interfere with life support systems if they reach critical concentrations." It was complete nonsense, but it sounded technical enough to be convincing. The Galactic nodded slowly, apparently accepting her explanation. "I see, and your readings indicate that these exotic particles are approaching dangerous levels." "Unfortunately, yes." Sarah's hand moved casually toward her belt where her railgun waited in its disguised form. "I need to complete this analysis and implement corrective measures immediately. Or we could be looking at a cascade failure that affects the entire station's atmospheric grid." The engineer's expression shifted subtly, and Sarah realized that he wasn't as convinced by her explanation as she had hoped. His compound eyes were tracking her movements with the kind of attention that suggested suspicion rather than professional interest. "Human technician," he said carefully. "I have worked with atmospheric systems for 43 years. I have never heard of quantum resonance patterns affecting life support in the manner you describe." The moment of decision had arrived. Sarah could attempt to continue the deception, hoping to complete her modifications before the Galactic engineer became actively suspicious, or she could acknowledge that her cover was blown and deal with the situation directly. She chose directness. "You're right," she said, her hand closing around the concealed weapon. "I'm not measuring atmospheric resonance patterns." The railgun materialized in her grip with the smooth efficiency of countless hours of practice, its targeting system already locked onto the lead engineer's center of mass. But instead of firing immediately, Sarah found herself hesitating for a fraction of a second. The Galactic engineer wasn't a hegemony conspirator. He was just a maintenance worker like herself, trying to do his job under impossible circumstances. His only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But that fraction of a second of hesitation was enough for the engineer's combat reflexes to engage. His powerful arm swept toward her in an arc that would have shattered human bones, while his other hand reached for the plasma cutter at his belt. Sarah's enhanced reflexes saved her life. allowing her to duck under the sweeping blow while bringing her weapon to bear. The hypervelocity projectile punched through the engineer's carapace with a sound like breaking glass, and the massive alien crashed to the chamber floor with a thunderous impact. The other 3 engineers reacted immediately, their engineering tools becoming weapons as they moved to surround the small human who had just killed their leader. Sarah's tactical mind assessed the situation in the microseconds before combat was joined. 3 opponents, each significantly larger and stronger than herself, armed with tools designed to cut through starship armor. Confined space that limited her mobility advantage. Reactor core systems that couldn't sustain much additional damage without triggering an uncontrolled explosion. Perfect conditions for demonstrating what human training could accomplish when survival was at stake. The fight lasted exactly 17 seconds. Sarah's railgun spoke twice more, its hypervelocity projectiles finding gaps in chitinous armor with surgical precision. The remaining Grontak engineers, despite their size and strength, had never faced an opponent who moved with the fluid lethality of a human operative at peak conditioning. Their engineering tools, formidable as they were, couldn't hit a target that seemed to flow like water between their attacks. When the chamber fell silent again, Sarah was alone with the reactor core and the modifications she needed to complete. The fusion reaction was approaching critical instability, its magnetic containment fields fluctuating wildly as the station's power grid struggled to maintain coherence under the ongoing bombardment. She returned to the control console with mechanical precision, her enhanced senses tracking the battle's progression through the vibrations that shook the station's superstructure. Shield strength was now at 37% and falling rapidly. The hegemony fleet had detected the arrival of consortium loyalist forces and was accelerating their assault, determined to eliminate the evidence before witnesses could document their crimes. The final modifications took less than a minute to implement. Sarah's fingers moved across the control interface with the confidence of someone who had spent months learning every detail of the station's systems. The reactor's safety protocols accepted her commands without question, recognizing her maintenance credentials and interpreting her actions as legitimate emergency procedures. When she finished, the fusion core was a weapon of unimaginable power, primed to detonate the moment shield strength dropped below 20%. The explosion would propagate outward at roughly 10% of light speed, an expanding sphere of nuclear fire that would catch the hegemony fleet at the precise moment when they were most vulnerable. But Sarah would never see it happen. The evacuation pods had long since departed, carrying what few crew members had been able to reach them before the final assault began. The station's corridors were empty except for the dead and the dying, and the atmospheric systems that Sarah had spent months maintaining were finally beginning to fail as power was diverted to the failing shields. She could have tried to reach one of the remaining escape pods. Her enhanced conditioning might have allowed her to survive the journey through the battle-damaged sections of the station. She might even have been able to convince the pod's automated systems to launch despite the combat conditions. Instead, she remained at the reactor control console, monitoring the weapon she had created and making minute adjustments to ensure that it would function exactly as intended. This was her responsibility now, to see that the hegemony paid the maximum possible price for their attempt at genocide. Through her neural link, she could access the station's external sensors and watch the final moments of the battle. The hegemony fleet was magnificent in its terrible efficiency. 24 warships maneuvering with practiced precision as they poured concentrated fire into the failing defensive grid. Their commanders had calculated the engagement perfectly, bringing overwhelming force to bear against a target that couldn't retreat or effectively fight back. They had made only one error in their planning. They had underestimated what one human being could accomplish when properly motivated. Shield strength dropped to 25%, then 23, then 21. The hegemony vessels moved closer, their weapons cycling to maximum power for the final assault that would break through the station's remaining defenses. Sarah could see their formation clearly now, a sphere of death that surrounded the dying station like vultures around a carcass. 20%. The reactor core's emergency protocols engaged with a sound like distant thunder, magnetic containment fields realigning themselves according to the modifications that Sarah had programmed. The fusion reaction began to accelerate beyond its normal parameters, drawing on fuel reserves that were normally held in reserve for emergencies. The hegemony ships detected the energy surge immediately, but their sensors interpreted it as a desperate attempt to boost power to the failing shields. They had no way of knowing that the station had just become the largest fusion bomb in recorded history. Sarah felt the deck plating begin to vibrate beneath her feet as the reactor core approached the point of no return. The chamber's radiation shielding was glowing now, stressed beyond its design limits by the energies contained within. She had perhaps 30 seconds before the explosion reached the control room. She used that time to record a final message, transmitted through her neural link to the same quantum communication array she had modified earlier. The message was brief, consisting of her real name, her mission parameters, and a complete technical description of what she had done to the reactor. Earth's intelligence services would want to know exactly how she had turned a civilian research station into a weapon capable of destroying an entire fleet. The vibrations increased, and Sarah could feel the heat beginning to penetrate the radiation shielding. The reactor core was now consuming its fuel at an exponential rate, the fusion reaction feeding on itself in a cascade that would culminate in an explosion visible from several star systems away. Outside the station, the hegemony fleet was beginning its final assault, confident that victory was within their grasp. Their weapons reached full power just as the station's last shield generator failed completely, leaving the hull exposed to direct bombardment. They had achieved their objective. Station Omega-7 was defenseless, its crew dead or fled, its databases ready for destruction or capture. The evidence of the hegemony conspiracy would be eliminated, and the planned genocide of humanity could proceed as scheduled. At least, that was what they believed in the few seconds before Sarah's modifications took effect. The explosion began at the reactor core and propagated outward at velocities that made mockery of conventional physics. The station's hull vaporized in the first microsecond, followed by the defensive platforms, the communication arrays, and everything else within a rapidly expanding sphere of nuclear fire. The hegemony fleet had exactly enough time to register the impossible energy readings before the blast wave reached them. The nearest ships simply ceased to exist, their molecular bonds torn apart by forces that no armor could withstand. Those farther away had a few additional seconds to transmit emergency signals before they too were consumed by the expanding inferno. Of the 24 ships that had come to destroy Station Omega-7, 3 survived. They limped away from the blast zone with critical damage and crews that would spend the rest of their lives trying to understand what had happened. Their sensor logs would provide the consortium with undeniable proof of the hegemony's attack, but more importantly, they would also document the price that humanity could exact when sufficiently provoked. The explosion was visible throughout the system, a new star that burned briefly but brilliantly before fading into the cosmic background. Emergency beacons from the surviving evacuation pods guided rescue ships to the scattered remnants of the station's crew, most of whom would live to testify about the conspiracy that had cost so many lives. And in the quantum communication networks that connected the galaxy, Sarah's final transmission propagated at faster than light speeds, carrying the truth about Project Sleeper and the operative who had single-handedly prevented a genocide. The Galactic Consortium would debate the ethics of what she had done for generations to come. Some would call her a hero, others a terrorist, but none would ever again make the mistake of underestimating what a human being could accomplish when everything they cared about was at stake. Sarah Chen had acted normal until the moment her training took over. By the time it was finished, the galaxy knew that humanity was far more dangerous than anyone had dared imagine. The message was received. The war was prevented, and the species that had dared to threaten human extinction learned to their cost that some fights are too dangerous to pick. Humanity had announced its place among the stars, and the announcement had been written in nuclear fire across the darkness of space.